Good evening, everyone. As you know, this night will be an English-speaking night. Very happy to welcome our two guests, Annina, Koivu, and Andrea Caputo. They both are architects. Annina, you studied in Helsinki, then you moved to Milan. And you told me you were switching from, let's say, a classical way of dealing with architecture in Helsinki to a more theoretical and political way of dealing with the discipline. Andrea, you studied in Ferrara, if I pronounce it correctly, and then you finished your studies in Milano. It's the opposite, exactly. I'm sorry. And I'm very happy to welcome you tonight because of, like I said, the topics I'm trying to raise with everyone for during this series of lectures, which is called La libération de l'objet. I won't again explain to you the topic, but like you understood, we are interested in understanding the relation between the things in architecture that holds together. And in this case, Andrea and Annina, they made this huge research, which is called U-Joints, which started in the beginning of 2018, January the 6th, like you told me, around a coffee in Milano, which was the beginning of a and we just received the book yesterday, but a beginning of a very, very impressive research about the way, again, object, where the necessity of joints between the object and the necessity of the understanding of the things that are connecting the object together. So from architecture to design, from design to architecture, how do we understand from the designers their knowledge of the necessity of the object holding together. So I'll be very short. Thanks again for coming in Paris, and have a very nice lecture. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for showing up in so many, and apologies that it's in English. My French went away with me learning Italian. I don't know how your French is. No.
0.
Okay, so you have to bear with us. Maybe one question, does any one of you have the U-Joints book? Ooh, there are some. Okay, well, maybe good or not good, I don't know. We're going to tell you about a book which is the result out of a 4-year research process, but maybe you want to start?
Yeah, well, it's, I would say it started in a very informal way, and it was really not planned as a project. It was something that was boiling in between us as a subject, and this is, in my opinion, the most interesting way of developing things in terms of speculation of design and architectural field, because at the end it never came up as an opportunistic initiative. At least was kind of honest, I would say, since the beginning, and we tried to keep it also an independent project from an editorial point of view, and so this for us was also a way to make a conclusion. So it started in a very independent way, not commissioned by any client or by any company, and after 4 years it also ended up being very independent as a publication, because basically we launched a crowdfunding time ago in order to seek for support. The book is really massive and also costly, and so we try to, let's say, back up, thanks to the bakers and also thanks to all the people which were really enthusiastic in the participation, and I'm also including, of course, architects and designers. And so this was exactly the trigger of the project. We had this conversation, and it was January, and so Annina suggested that it wouldn't be a fantastic content for Design Week, the Salone del Mobile in Milano, and we were really not organized in that scope, in that perspective, but we just launched this open call between designers and architects, aiming to collect their joinery projects all together for a collective show to be presented in the city. And I think this was the trigger, and this was really the motivation, because everybody actually decided to participate, and it was even big names, I mean, from Ingo Maurer to Gricic, Burlek, and also upcoming designers. But we were really surprised that everybody joined the call, and in a way, we felt that we touched a sort of chord into the design and architecture field which was not investigated before. I mean, of course, there's plenty of books of Japanese wooden joinery, sailor, rope joinery, and many specific topics, but at the end, the joint as a field of analysis, especially if it's, let's say, cross between design and architecture, was never considered as a topic. And possibly we were really lucky to really grasp this kind of feeling, which was paradoxically the daily struggle for many designers and daily struggle for even architects. And so a sort of common ground to start with.
Oh, okay. So exactly, the important part was when we were thinking of what to do for the Salone, which was only 3 months away, was finding or having a topic that could interest both, right? It could interest the designer as much as it could interest the architect. So what happened from early January until then April is what you described as an open call that was received really well. I think we said that if we can convince 10 designers to participate, we do an exhibition, but it just kind of hit a nerve and it kept on growing until on show we had to change the space in the meantime as well, but on show we had 856 objects by 50 designers, which were often also specially made for the exhibition. So the nerve was hit in a way that it was worth looking at the detail of an object rather than, I don't know, maybe as an invitation to the visitors that you should look at an object, look at it in detail, at how it has been made, at its joinery, rather than quickly going with an image, I like it, I don't, swipe left, right, thumbs up, thumbs down, and so on. So take the moment to look and then actually understand how good design and architecture are made. These are images of the first show in Milan. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, already then, at that time, this kind of transition between architecture and design scale was our concern. Of course, the objects that you see here are amazing solutions for this kind of topic, but there was as well a sort of initial taken on the Japanese wooden joinery, so this was also very much needed in the moment that we had to, let's say, expand the research into a field which was more at the urban scale. And so the exhibition was based on this hierarchy, I would say. It was really trying to build up a sort of thematic areas and different topics. But again, we didn't want to, let's say, pretend much in terms of also exhibition design. I mean, I wanted to be clear that, and we wanted to be clear that at the end it was a very basic intuition and not really needed of like, let's say, a juxtaposition of elements or articulation. And so maybe in a very unconscious way, it became a sort of wedding set up with these white tables and a white cloth, with also the cheapest kind of setup we could afford. And at the end, it was quite impactful because it was sort of democratic. No, it was really, let's say, keeping all the objects and the intervention at the same level, at the same time organizing everything very well. So I'm still quite fascinated by this very simple approach that we had back then, which I think is in a way evoking the spirit of the whole project.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we should say what U-joints is. You could see it in the pictures that U-joints are taxonomy of connections. There's somewhere a definition here. Sorry, I'm scanning. Here we are. Can you read that? I think you can read that more or less. But until the very last day, I think we were looking for a definition ourselves because we were also pointed that there's a very distinct distinction between a joint and a connection. Finally, we speak about both. We don't exclude one or the other, but this is one definition we came about, which I can quickly read. Can you read that? I can't see that. Really? Mm-hmm. Right.
Whether hidden or in plain sight, a well-conceived join is the core of any project, establishing a relationship between parts and determining the quality of the overall work.
Exactly, because I also have another definition which we played with quite for a long time. So U-joints, of course, stands for universal joints, but it goes defined as the place where two or more parts of an object are joined together. But not only, it's also the connection in the sense of a relationship in which a person or a thing is linked, associated with someone or something else. And I think we realized fairly quickly that it's not only about the constructual element of the joint, but also everything that evokes. It evokes whether it's a story, whether it is the person who invented it, the person who applied it, the person who changed it. I think we, after the Milan exhibition, fairly quickly understood that there's more to it than just understanding how a joint works. I hope you agree.
Yeah, and this was actually, after Milano, somehow we grasped a sort of curatorial interest in doing more. And so actually the book came way after. We accepted the call of a few institutions to expand their research into other fields. I mean, belonging to joinery, but different ones. And so Winterthur and Lausanne and other projects came up. So the idea was really trying to inscribe a very specific joinery topic for every exhibition. And again, at the beginning especially, we were not really aware about that we were going to the editorial phase, but for sure this was a sort of very organic approach in order to lead into a more scientific, but I hope not pretentious editorial project. This was exactly the case. Now the book was generated by the addition of independent curatorial interventions such as this one, which is based on the adhesive and fused joints we did in Winterthur. And it was exciting. I mean, it was just an exhibition about glues, basically. And it may sound weird, but at the end, glue per se is actually the greatest connector, no? The most invisible one and the most maybe underestimated and
most used,
yeah,
and less seen.
But very so. At the beginning was a very bulimic approach of collecting all the glues from all over Europe, Asia, US, and really trying to find out all the characteristics of these stickers, of these tapes, and of these elements. And at the end, it was really searching into, from Leroy Merlin to any other supplier, Tokyo Hands in Japan and stuff, and really trying to make a sort of analysis about the strengths, about the degree of freedom, about the release, about the fact that if the glue was a sort of not reversible glue or not. And so, at the end we realized that we were really obsessed with this, with all the topic, and we built up a team. Actually, this is also very needed to say, you know, with Marta, Margherita, Eleonora. There was a fantastic team of people which, in a way, decided to join the case and to build up a sort of informal PhD project altogether. So, no, just to maybe close this part, I think it's very important to underline the fact that from an independent initiative, you can really discover not just a new universe that is belonging to it, but you can really, let's say, impact on, I mean, the public, I mean, and also the university field that was really attracted by this initiative. And it doesn't have to come out necessarily out of a very academic approach. This is what I think is important to say about UJoint. It started in a very, very, let's say, naive attitude, and I believe this is also what keeps you alive when you run an architectural practice or when you're in your professional career, to keep margin, to keep space for something which is really not maybe even belonging to what you daily do as a job or as a daily work, but to possibly develop the sort of research years during university after. And at least from my point of view, this was the biggest benefit I could express from UJoint.
It was very luxurious for 4 years to just do this somehow and to learn things and keep on learning and keep on digging. Maybe before we dive into UJoint as the publication as well, maybe a few words on how it has been organized. So after the Milan exhibition, we realized that there's more to it that we should actually figure out and try to analyze. And looking at the entire world of joints, there was no limit in the very beginning. And Eleonora Castellarin was our guru in that. I think her brief was just try to find every joint you can find, which she did. At some point we told her she should stop, but then she said that there's still more to discover, so she can't stop yet, which resulted in a taxonomy of 1,300 joints. The taxonomy means that we, like an encyclopedia, and UJoints is not an encyclopedia, but in an encyclopedic way, we list joints. They're the most common ones, but there are also rare cases and maybe just unique joints that exist one time in the world or joints that we like. So we have the curatorial freedom to select certain things. So that's why it's not an encyclopedia, because it's not complete in that sense. And in order to make sense to all of this, the book and the research is organized in 6 chapters. Every chapter starts with a taxonomy, and the chapters are basic fasteners, which is nails, screws, rivets, bolts, and nuts, etc. Then we have mechanical joints, which is an enormous world, which can go from clamps to springs to hinges and so on. So basically those that create movement or that absorb movement. Then there's wooden joints, there's knits and knots, which is everything interwoven, let's say. Then we have welding, adhesives, and I'm missing one.
No.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Was that 6? I hope that was 6. So the book is organized in kind of a scientific way, but next to the taxonomy, which is in the beginning of every chapter, opens up another world, which is the stories, anecdotes, commentaries, interviews, weird curiosities which we collected looking at these joints, because it felt too straightforward only to look at the kind of technical detailing of a joint, because there's so much more to discover, and I think that's what we're also going to talk about more today. We have 2 different, just to say, we have 2 different insights. Andrea speaking more about architecture, me speaking more about design, and I think well, I don't think anything. You should just start.
Well, yeah, it's actually an in-between scale which was leading the whole project. This field of analysis which was very clear, at least for us, in between design and architecture. And also the topic of today, libération de l'objet, is also helping in this, because in a way, understanding the joint as an object is also helping when we have to, let's say, describe the leap of scale, no, between these two fields. And so I'm glad that we came up to this object idea today, because it's really almost all about that. Even when we talk about the architectural scale, this is, as you can see from the slide, is also very much going into the object direction. And we also kept it very broad. I mean, it's not just designers. I mean, the engineers are, I think, the majority of the architectural contributes in the book are made by engineers, just because from modernity, all the systems that have been developed by engineers are coming out of an object like the one we are looking at, but are going into a direction of the overscaled and the megastructure. This was an obsession from the 50s ahead between engineers to cover the largest span in terms of distance and structure. And actually, this three-dimensional approach was the majority of the time defined by this kind of devices. And this, through decades, contributes into building up the infrastructure landscape that we know in present time. I mean, from airports to hangars, train station, canopies. The largest spans are, the majority of time, defined by this kind of element. And so this contributes were actually for us a key point in the beginning of this research, assuming that the spherical joint with its 18 holes aiming to adopt 18 bars were actually the first element in order to develop theoretical projects or pragmatical projects that maybe we all know now. Buckminster Fuller, of course, it's very known, and the geodesic structures are really known, but all of these are actually depending on a specific unit, a specific element, which is this join, this spherical join person. But then in this adventure, we, of course, bump into hyper-creative designers and architects, such as Waxman, which, as described Bruno Zevi, is not just an architect. I mean, it's really, maybe in this description, is more an utopian, a person which possibly influenced, the impact on Waxman is huge, much more than the impact of things that he did, because basically he couldn't manage to build much. But even from this picture, you can see that at his birthday party, from John Cage to Buckminster Fuller to Frank Gehry, I mean, the impact he had on the designers and the architects and on the cultural environment of in this field was incredibly huge, because it was maybe the first one to really imagine in the 40s and in the 50s that out of hinges, out of joinery, you could build up a new language. And so this is an experimentation on hinges he made, and you can see that according to the degree of freedom you have, combining, welding more hinges, you can build up the most let's say, creative and evocative structure you can imagine. And those experimentations was really the first time that it happened. I mean, this was in the US. It was coming from Germany, but it was actually in the US where it managed to get its largest commission. This was 1951 for the US Air Force. So the American military army commissioned him the first biggest hangars, because of course with the 3D span system that was belonging to the sphere that we were looking before, he was really able to conceive overscale structure perfectly adaptable for any sort of functional need of airplanes, especially military airplanes. And it's quite complex in the way he did it. But it's so complex that at the end, paradoxically, didn't need any screw or any nail. So the whole structure is based on compression. And I think this is just fantastic, because if you look at the Japanese ancient architecture, this was also the case, no? That they were always avoiding to use nails. But it was just all about components, and components combined in a way, such as this one, that were not needing screws or other elements. So basically here there was a central primary pipe, and the three blue parts were welded to it. And then there was these locking elements, in red, which were embracing the pipe and connecting these clasps, these green elements. So you see from one single green element, you can then interconnect three pipes again. And this is, of course, this has to be imagined in an endless way. So the value of Waxman, it was, and this utopian character, it was about conceiving structures which were not supposed to finish. So, and this is why it was really influential with many other artists and architects. And also sometimes being very practical. This is an experimentation he did with Walter Gropius in 42. Basically, they founded a corporation which was something like a generic panel corporation. It was a company, and Gropius and him, of course, after World War II, they were really in the need of going for mass production. So this was a timber system for housing, completely prefabricated, which was held together thanks to this clamp. This clamp, it was made of two parts, and basically the inclined one used to go inside, and then with a very simple movement was able to hold together walls, ceiling, and floor. And of course, this is also a consequence of the genius of Waxman and of the methodology of Gropius, which was coming in the US after the Bauhaus and after this other standardization and prefabrication logics. So this was really the beginning of our research, engineers, which all of a sudden came to be a constant discovery on other designers and engineers which were less known. This is Emilio Pérez Piñón, is way less known, from Spain. As a student, he had no resources, but he has this brilliant and very ambitious idea of producing a dome which was able to collapse and to be shipped and assembled in a very short time. So it was a sort of chair in a way, no? So in effect, it came to this idea from the tripod chair, which was really an element, very basic element made out of three sticks connected in the middle, and then expanded thanks also to the textile. But after his studies, Emilio Pérez, he managed to really go for public commissions. So this was in 1967 in Madrid. He managed to build a pavilion which was 8,000 square meters out of 12 by 9 modules, which were basically assembled in one day. And this is very surprising because Emilio Pérez started from nothing. And even the way of processing all this kind of technology was very informal, made out of maquettes, because there was no chance to translate this complexity into a drawing. And so out of basic resources, these engineers became incredibly creative. That's a story belonging to the Italian country after the war again. Actually, this is after the First World War. This is in the 20s. And that's the story of another engineer, Fernando Innocenti. Well, it's very simple that it's devastating in how much he impacted on the kind of building process we know today. Basically, Innocenti invented the scaffolding system. And starting from regular pipes, 48 mils, so something which was already very common to find, he invented a clamp, which is the one in the picture, very easy to screw in between two poles. The two pipes were able to build up an overall infrastructural scaffolding, such as this huge bridge, in a very short time. And today, for us, it's very easy to see it in every city. I mean, this became a standard which is really influencing our contemporary times. But it came out of this clamp. And this is actually the invention. This is actually the patent that he made him famous and able to build up then a language, which was again a transition between the architectural realm and the design field. Because of course we know that tables are, or let's say any sort of balustrade are made out of this, but even large public infrastructure, in the 60s, the majority of Italian football stadiums were built out of this system. And this tribune was holding 6,000 people. So again, we maybe all known about this kind of structures, but what we don't associate the structure with is this joint. And this is very symbolic of the old research, because at the end, the solution of a language which belongs to our generation and previous generation is actually coming out of sometimes a single device. So at a certain moment, I remember that we were a bit stuck in the research, thinking that, at least for the architectural field, the only way to conceive joinery, it was the large number, the multitude. Because of course, all the examples that we saw before belongs to the idea of having thousands of joints. And then I remember we get a fantastic contribution from Tom Peters, which is exactly describing this kind of importance. And it's also sort of a political statement. I've also read this. I mean, it might be annoying, but it's really worth it. So it's actually about US and the balloon frame, which I guess, I mean, if you're architecture students, this is quite familiar, I think so. And balloon frame is basically constituting the largest percent of American domestic construction, the suburbia, but sometimes even larger structures. And it's basically wooden frame technology, which was really, really easy and basic to build up. But the thing is, all of that is belonging to the nail. So the light timber frame is put together by means of an admittedly poor connection, the nail. But when the nail is used in large numbers and spread evenly throughout the structure, it behaves statistically, as each carries the stresses of a structure in conjunction with all others. Nail connections therefore hold, thanks to their quality and pattern of distribution rather than quality of the connection each one makes. The nail is thus a democratic rather than autocratic connector, and its success is governed by behavioral consensus and its geographical distribution throughout the structure rather than by individual excellence. American culture may indeed be a consumer culture in which the emphasis lies more on quantity than on quality, but here the trade-off was clearly of practical advantage. The statical or cumulative principle of many identical connectors lead to standardization of building components. The American light timber frame is fully industrialized, prefabricated systems, studs, plywood, particle boards, nails, and connectors are all manufactured in standard lengths and sizes, but in such an elementary way that precise tolerances are irrelevant and quality control superfluous. This requires that the system be seen as an integrated whole. No part can be pulled out of the context and analyzed. It simply makes no sense without its context. The single nail is nothing other than a very poor connector. The single stud is a thin stick indeed. Yet together they form a sound structure. This integrated anti-analytical approach led to a creation of the American form of prefabricated construction. So in short, the housing business and the housing development in the US was not planned. It was really coming out of a very pragmatical approach that was not considering the mistake. And thinking about how we design and how we consider architecture as a European, this is a drastic shift. Because in Europe, we are very conceptual. No, we are really hyper concerned on things, on the consequence of what you do, on the impact of what you do. America is just a matter of rolling out and being really, practical in that sense. But in order to do that, you need to use a unit, which is the nail, which at the end, as an element per se, has zero value, because it's in the thousands of nails that you build up this kind of cloud. So, I mean, the article is very, very long and very articulated in its complexity, but it's really touching the point. And this is also maybe why we went into the Lausanne project with so much obsession, because at the end, this kind of speculation on the single screw was the old driver, and it was actually very, as you said, feeling as a luxury to, let's say, build up an exhibition just on nails and screws. But it's not just that. Luckily, there are examples of architecture cases where the single object compared to the multitude still has a value. Well, and of course, I had to pick up a fantastic contribute on Peter Rice and on when he was conceiving the Saint Pompidou project with Rogers and Renzo Piano. Of course, it was a sort of, again, speculation on the 60s, no? And all this hyper-flexible, programmatic constructions. But at the end was Peter Rice, which was making the research on Enrique Gerber, which in the 19th century invented the gerberet. So the gerberet was actually in between a post and a beam, helping to cantilever out a building. And it was basically, firstly, used for bridges, and then in the beginning of 20th century for offshore oil platform. So it was an industrial context. Peter Rice understood that it was the perfect device for this kind of project. And basically, the huge trusses that we all know are held by this kind of system, which is so iconic to, in my opinion, become the language of the building. So there are very few cases, and I don't recall any other cases just like the Saint Pompidou, where the gerberet, where the joinery, it's so symbolic to become, let's say, the driver of the old project, of the old building. And out of that, there was a sort of school coming out. I mean, it was not just them, but of course, Rogers and Foster were the key players of this technological approach in architecture. And there's one of my favorite contributes in the book is written by Dejan Sudic, and it's about the difference between Rogers and Foster. And it's a fantastic text where it's basically creating all the analogies and all the differences between the two. Of course, they started together. This is in Swindon, a project which was seminal for them. They were together back then, as you might know, the Team 4. It was a partnership intending to build up a building with product which was coming off the shelf. So the old building in Swindon was basically realized with product which was already produced in the market. Nothing was done custom. And the beauty comes out of it. So it was, again, a very essential approach to the design. When they split, when they got success, and then when they built up independent, fantastic careers, there was a different take on joinery between Foster and Rogers, as Dejan puts very well in this text. Basically, on one side, we have Foster, which is a classicist, which is a minimalist of joinery. Basically, his approach is reducing. And on the contrary, Rogers always went into a sort of industrial romanticism, a way to express the joinery as much as he could. Of course, Saint Pompidou is a good example. And so on one side we have someone which is basically trying to hide the joint, Foster, and someone which makes the joint as the key element of his career. And so in between two materials, Foster used to have a gap and Rogers a joint. And so this is the kind of, I think, interesting conception that we should value when we approach this kind of scale. And in conclusion, the joinery has been always a point between architects and builders. This is a very old manual about the Italian palazzo. At the end, it's a construction manual, but by our understandings, the way you see things being connected goes exactly in this direction of thinking that at the end, even the most ancient palazzo, brick and mortar, is made out of this kind of components and this kind of joinery, from wood to steel to anybody else, and any materials that it could be conceived. And we find so many connections between this kind of procedure together with the Asian traditional Buddhist temples that were, again, fabricated according to this kind of technology, even in contemporary times. This is a Kengokuma building, very contemporary language, but at the end is not so far away from the Dudong bracket belonging to the Chinese architecture. So again, as he explained to us when we were interviewing for the book, he says, the fact that we rely on this kind of technology, it's really all about flexibility. In Japan, especially due to the earthquake, due to humidity, well, first of all, you cannot use nails because the humidity is really a big problem for that. But the flexibility is actually the main topic for Japanese architects. The way of doing something which is reversible and possibly able to be changed. And so this kind of culture, through the centuries, build up a sort of knowledge that is not just Kengokuma, it's also, if you recall, Shigeru Ban. It's many architects in Japan, they really conceive the building in a very different way. And it's also interesting the fact that when they go really complex, like here, they use a specific joint, which is the interlocking hell. Shijoku Gami is the Japanese name. Basically, the interlocking hell is a joint which is impossible to be dismantled. You have to burn out the building if you want to, let's say. So, and it's unique. I mean, every joint in Japan is reversible, but exactly this one has been conceived in the few cases that. So when I gave this question to Kengokuma about the fact that there was a joinery which was not reversible, he was really brilliant in this answer because he said, yes, true, but at the end, it's endless. I mean, it's true that once you produce it, it's not reversible, but it's a sort of fractal. And when you start with this sort of composition, it's so organic that it could grow endlessly. And so, again, it's about flexibility. Again, it's about adaptation. Again, it's about also the metabolist approach that the Japanese used to have in the 60s. So there's always this kind of conception in their mind. And all of this was really fascinating in the research. Now, as a conclusion, when also we were about to finish the book, at least in the architectural part, for me it was really important to understand if there's a sort of conclusion of all this analysis. And I'm actually quite concerned about the importance of joinery in architecture, in the sense that at the end of the day, we don't really start from that as architects. And at the end of the day, there's very few publications which are recalling the joinery, but compared to the history of architecture, it's really nothing. And even when Rencolos did the Biennale in Venice, elements, which actually based on components, the joinery was missing completely. So I believe that we are subjected to design, especially today, architecture by components. I mean, think about Revit. We have to sort of digest the building according to components and to elements. The BIM today, it's actually the way, and in the future, to, let's say, transform a concept into a fabrication. But at the end, we don't really start from that. And this is, to me, in terms of consciousness, what we really have to grasp. We really have to understand that at the end, it's maybe sad to say as a conclusion, but the joint is a tool, but not a driver as much as in design. And with this, I pass you the mic.
It's my turn. I wasn't really sure where to start, so we could have started from the question, what connects a police officer, an airplane, and a server farmer, which would be the cable tie. We could have, or we could speak about the elastic band, which holds up a sofa as much as it is the tool to hold up Pierre Chapin's design exercises. We, as already mentioned, scaffolding. We could look at Fellini's movie sets as much as a fake fascist architecture, which were built thanks to Innocenti. We could ask how Marilyn Monroe actually helped the success of a Finnish fishing lure company. We could speculate whether the hook of Captain Hook is only a myth or actually the beginning of a very functional prosthetic on pirate ships. We should definitely ask whether the Eames plywood chair could exist without the shock mount, and here you have a patent to it. And then, of course, the question is also what links Mark Newson's highly bitting lounge chair with the Eiffel Tower and Rosie the Riveter, and of course it's the rivet. These are all questions we looked at in the book, and going through the most diverse possibilities of joints at some, maybe halfway through the project, it occurred to me that the joints could actually, it was a question, could they be history's missing elements? If we look at microhistory focuses on ordinary people and the peculiar moments in their everyday lives. In this sense, microhistorians view people not as a group, but rather as individuals who shouldn't get lost within history's process and anonymous groups. And by paying attention to the smaller individual stories can help us to understand the bigger picture by drawing connections to history's general storyline and also fill in some gaps. One of the founding fathers of microhistory, Carlo Ginzburg, actually, and he's the author of The Cheese and the Worms, which I highly recommend you to read if you're interested in microhistory. He added the definition that the micro and microhistory should be understood in microscopic, so it's, he describes it as an intensive approach to any topic, also the smallest element. But he also points out that it's not the individual case per se that is emblematic, it's always, again, the bigger picture. So how you can extract something larger from looking at something initially small. And that's when he says the micro should be read in relation to the macro. At the end, it's a bit like the chicken and the egg. So, you know, on one hand, you can ask, are you interested in universal history in general or the general history in particular? Finally, both are equally important, and that's sort of what we did. So one of the questions could be whether the famous nails, screws, rivets, bolts, and nuts that you have already heard of could be our cheese and worms, and what we can draw as a bigger picture by looking at the smaller things. The work I think we did for U-joints can be very well compared to detective work, ending hopefully luckier than it did for Mark Lombardi, who by his obsession went beyond and didn't come back anymore. But basically what any research is about, that you follow the evidence In our case, you want to understand how an object was realized, the knowledge that goes into its making, the tools that were at the creator's disposal, and you should also always look at the alternative solutions which actually kicked off the next solution. And it's kind of an ongoing, there's never an end to it somehow, because it's almost like a domino, right? One stone kicks off the next one, and that's, I think, like we pointed out already several times, was the problem also to stop at some point. There are a lot of quotes by famous people about the importance of design, and one thing we should be very aware of and remind ourselves all the time that we don't fall into generalizations. So we shouldn't do any kind of over-the-top claims and say that the rivet is more important than the Eiffel Tower. Of course it's not. It's always, you know, the object that then helps the designer, architect, or engineer to do something with it. And in all of these quotes, maybe the last one by this one, by Kari Virtanen, who is a Finnish cabinet maker, might be, and it's also again quite in line with what Andrea was saying, that a joint is simply part of the overall project and is always a means to an end. It's not about the celebration of the joint, it still needs to do its job. Of course, in new joints, we celebrate it a lot, because we also look at the aesthetics of it. And I thought now to focus on one chapter specifically, which is knots and knits. And the first question to ask is, what links an ancient Inca, a bored fisherman, and an acrobat? It's the knot. So if we start by thinking about the knot is probably history's oldest joint. It was originally probably used for the first time to tie a stick, a wooden stick, and a piece of rock and create an axe or a weapon, or it could be to tie up an animal or just carry your belongings. Not in prehistorical times, but about 2,000 years ago, the knot became much more for the first time that it was for, let's say, everyday survival. In South America, the Inca created quipu, which is a sort of recording device cum necklace. You can see that it's made out of strings of cotton or wool, which are knotted, and there are different colors. And all these elements are actually very specific. So the colors of the strings are important, but even more so the position of the knot, the distance to the knot, or between knots, and the quantity of knots. It was, even if not completely clear today how it worked, but it's speculated that it was a recording device and it worked with numerical data in the decimal system. So it recorded anything from tax obligations, military movements, calendar things, or just collected data. Now, if you look up in the left top corner, enlarged you see this. This is Ashley's Book of Knots. It contains 3,900 knots or knot variations, which is enormous, and the book itself is also enormous. So we are not the only ones who do big books, really. Thanks to this book, the International Guild of Knot Tiers was founded, because it contains everything you need to know about knot making. But maybe one of the most interesting stories is that the knot, as we know it today, and the variations of it, were mostly invented by sailors on very long trips on the open sea. Boredom brought them about to reinvent the knot over and over and again. And it's also research that actually the development of different knots stopped once seamen started to read and books came on ships, because they had another activity against their boredom. It is also said that 1978 was the last knot variation invented. It's called the hunter's bend, but that has already been contradicted. So you can see that the members of the International Guild of Knot Tiers are very precise about the history of knot. Another person who is also a member of this guild is Philippe Petit, And he actually says, it's good that we have 3,900 variations of knot, but really you only need 5. I don't know if you all remember who is Philippe Petit. He's the man who walked on a cable, galvanized and twisted, between the World Trade Towers in 1974, 7th of August. And we made an interview with him talking about knots that save lives, because you can imagine how important it is, how well the tightrope is spanned between two towers when you don't have any safety net. And he doesn't have safety nets, so he is completely dependent on the quality of his knots. In the interview, he very vividly records how they secretly went up onto one of the two towers, and he was the person to tie the cable there, but of course he couldn't go onto his endpoint, onto the other tower. So he had prepared, already before of course, a 21-page letter to his best friend, who was the person to do the knot on the other side once the cable arrived there, shot with an arrow. And, well, it all worked out very well. But he insisted that really you don't need so many knots. There are only 5 which can get you out of any tricky situation. And we picked up his 5 and added, I have to admit, other 5, because it sounds just nicer to have 10 knots and different applications for them. But then if we look at knots, of course, they have been fundamental in many different things. They have been fundamental in carrying and wrapping food, like in this beautiful book, How to Wrap 5X, which illustrates different knotting techniques beautifully. And American designer George Nelson actually wrote the introduction to the book and said, it is a collection of knots that's totally unexpected. It's a totally unexpected monument to a culture, a way of life, of the smallest, most inconsequential and ephemeral thing. So that puts it maybe in the most beautiful way. We also looked into other kinds of knots, still with food, but also these, which are less friendly versions maybe of knots, sort of unsolved infrastructure entanglements. Sorry. Knots have been fundamental in the development of playgrounds, but then also in scaffolding again, and we go back to a bit what Andrea was also saying. The particularity of bamboo scaffoldings, which are most prominent in South Asia, is that originally these enormous scaffolding structures, and the highest scaffolding went apparently up 180 meters, were originally knotted or bound together by strings of fiber. And it said that it took years to master the technique, to learn how to combine trunks and these kind of knots. Today, often cable ties are used, but still bamboo and the knotting of them is or should be the most efficient, because they're lighter, they're stronger, they're faster to assemble or disassemble, and they grow also faster and more ecologically. I think you have all been handed a inflatable poodle by a street clown once in your life. In the book, we also dedicated some pages to a Japanese artist called Masayoshi Matsumoto, who takes the twisting and knotting of balloons to a whole new level. So maybe the poodle that you received took a few seconds to do, but with the very same twisting and knotting technique, he makes these marvelous animals which can take up to up to a day to prepare. Then what happens when knots are repeated in a line? We basically come to knitting, and I don't give you the technical definitions of these. But if we speak about knitting, we could speak about the herring girls. Those were women who traveled port to port on the coast of England following the migration of herring and other fish, because they went to gut and pack the fish. But in the spare time, they knitted. They knitted the famous Guernsey fisherman jumpers, which in themselves is an entire study of how the patterns were designed. But you have to imagine organza is a square jumper. You can wear it front or left. The sleeves are short because you don't want to get the hook entangled in your sleeve. It has extra padding in your armpit, and the patterns are very distinct. Originally, the patterns were actually used for if a fisherman fell into the sea and was flooded to shore, he could be recognized by the pattern of his jumper to where he came from. So his corpse could be also turned back. But because these women moved and chatted and exchanged patterns, the pattern distinction became more and more complicated, and you can actually today on the coast of France find patterns that originated in Ireland and vice versa. Also, stockings are knitted. You might not remember that, but with the invention of nylon in 1938 and the circular knitting machine, nylons and stockings came about, which were called stronger than steel, but as thin as spider webs. And of course, we know it was a huge success, but what's interesting is that the technique of knitting thin mesh was the starting point also again to design projects like Bruno Monari's Falkland, where he just pulled stockings over metal rings, or Pierre Paulin's not only the tank chair but many others. It was also, thanks to the knitted stocking, possible to probably do the world's proper flat pack chair. The up, also called La Mamma by Gaetano Pesce, came, as you can see in these images, in a vacuum bag. Once opened, the sponge inflated, but it didn't just inflate into any kind of shape. The shape was actually given thanks to the knotted stocking. And then, of course, this is just to remind that in the book you can also find factory visits and photo reportage. So we tell you how knitted fabric is being made and how it actually developed from mattresses to upholstery for furniture. Another story is, and probably now we're moving into weaving, so it's not anymore of intertwining a single yarn, but over intertwining or interweaving them, warp and weft, and we go to weaving. We should always be careful to say that something has been one of the world's most important inventions, because that's kind of a credential that's taken a bit too easily sometimes. In the case of the jacquard loom, we probably can say so. It might be on the same level as the wheel, because weaving looms, or the work with weaving looms was very tedious, and actually took two weavers to produce textiles. But when Jacquard in 1804, he was a French merchant from Lyon, invented the automated jacquard loom, he all by sudden didn't even understand, but he triggered or ignited the Industrial Revolution, because all by sudden mass production in textiles, the reproduction of patterns was possible. And all this was possible thanks to punch cards, which he implemented in the loom. A punch card, as you can see here, is a card with holes. But that allowed him to reproduce patterns. It didn't take many more years, maybe 200 years afterwards, there was a English Countess of Lovelace. She was actually the daughter of Lord Byron, not a poet herself, but a mathematician who understood the link from the punch card jacquard loom to computing, and she is called the first computer programmer. She understood it, as you can see it in this quote, but she also understood it as she was introduced to a researcher called Charles Babbage, who was working on the first so-called computer, or first automatic computer, called the analytical machine. And they were both inspired by the jacquard loom, because they understood that they could use the punch card not in order to weave patterns into a textile, but thanks to the binary code of 0 and 1, you could actually feed information to a machine which could also be stored. So basically whole, not whole, 0 or 1. So that's where the binary code comes from, not only in the beginnings of computers, but it actually comes from weaving. it is quite surprising how this idea of weaving and computing persisted for many more decades. Especially, it was triggered even more when we come to the age of space travel. In this picture, you have a core memory. A core memory, I don't know technically exactly what it is, but I have read by our brilliant author who actually knows better, that it's a core memory that was also used in a guidance system of space travel, like the Apollo mission and so on. So basically, without this memory card, an airplane or a spacecraft could not fly. But the curiosity is that these were actually hand-stitched or hand-sewn or woven. So you had two women, like in this picture, sitting in front of each other, and with a needle and a thread, or wire, they passed the wire through little magnets. If the wire went through, it's a 1. If it went around, it's a 0. So that's how, by hand sewing, binary code was created in order to run the onboard computer for the Apollo mission. What is peculiar in all of this is that the then NASA engineers didn't really appreciate the work and the very meticulous work of these women, because they started calling the memory cards the LOL cards, thanks to little old ladies who were actually producing them. And stitching and sewing also continued with spacesuits, for example, that the astronauts had to wear, also called pressure suits. They basically were, again, a matter of life and death, right? So you had to wear it, because if you didn't wear it going to space, either you would burn, you would freeze, or probably you would explode. I don't know. So these suits were hand-sewn out of up to 21 layers of textile, including Teflon and Kevlar and so on, but with an enormous precision, so to the precision of 0.3 millimeters. This was again possible because the women, the seamstresses who worked for NASA, had been hired by another factory. In this case, they actually made a competition. The competition was won by Playtex, which was a lingerie manufacturer. So the seamstresses who had before worked on bras and underwear were now sewing the spacesuits for Neil Armstrong, for example, simply because they had the precision in the needlework to be able to do that. And they didn't even get any pins or so on, because a pin left in the suit would cause any fatal incident in space. So it's quite magnificent to understand and see how they were able to do that. Still seamstresses, I realize. We made an interview with one of today's seamstresses at NASA. So she works, Liam Fenn, she works there. And today her job is not anymore spacesuits, but she sews, like, let's say, the hem of a skirt, these thermal blankets that typically, I think you know from, the blankets a marathon runner gets over his or shoulder at the end of a race. So they are there, again, to insulate satellites, for example, and they cannot be welded or glued because neither welding or gluing could withstand the heat in outer space. So still they have to go back to kind of the old-fashioned techniques. Sorry. Precision, of course, also becomes a matter, and we have a little anecdote about the precision of the needlework of a surgeon. And here you have the different stitches that you have to learn as a surgeon, I was told. But if we, besides looking at a practical needlework, like in this case, the repair or upgrade of clothing, what I wanted to tell you a bit more about is how embroidery has always been a conveyor of messages. On the left-hand side, you have some abstract patterns of quilts. I think you all know quilts are the blankets and bed covers, specifically born in Northern America. And there's a beautiful book and story called, what is it called? Hidden in Plain View, which tells the story of African-American quilter Ozella McDaniel Williams. And She says that the quilts that were made by slaves were imbued with hidden codes to help guide escaped slaves as they navigated the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses that led to the freedom in the North. And she claims that actually certain quilts, when they were hung on a washing line or draped over a fence, conveyed these messages. Here's a safe house, there's danger, or something was like, go to the woods and hide, for example. It also has to be said that this book has been very controversial because other researchers say that there's not enough evidence that these patterns actually have such messages to them. But it's interesting still to think about it. Another person who did very high-end needlework was Mary Queen of Scots, and Claire Hunter wrote a beautiful essay about this. So, like I think you remember that Mary Queen of Scots lived on house arrest until she was executed in 1578, I think, by the order of Queen Elizabeth I, 1587, yes. And being under house arrest, of course, it was a good pastime to do needlework and embroidery, but it was also something that basically every woman was doing, whether rich or poor. And you can imagine that her mail and writings were closely monitored by her captors. So she had to invent, or she didn't have to, but she invented another way of getting messages out. On one side, she embroidered hidden messages to her allies outside, but she also embroidered these kind of panels which were metaphors to her misery. So in this case, for example, you have a red cat which plays with a mouse on a checkered floor, and that clearly illustrates her in her misery. It's also quite interesting to think how in quite a lot of these stories that I have already mentioned, there's always a question of life and death somehow, and or hidden messages, for example. Life and death, you can not really see, if not in this little text there, but life and death or death threats continued to be fairly common even until the 1700s, when craftsmen of lace making were threatened for treason. The story basically is that in 1665, the French Minister of the State decided that French lace making is very unpopular and fairly poor, and France needs to do something to catch up with Venice and the Point de Venise, which was highly successful and very lavish and effective. And he engaged in corporate espionage. He tried to lure Venetian lace makers to France and engaged in all kinds of tools. So it shows again how even lace making and embroidery get a kind of other level of importance in all of this. The image on the left is just something else, a little side anecdote about these ruffs. That's what these wheels are called, that were typically worn around the neck. They were a status symbol. They were a symbol of wealth, because on one side, it's fairly impossible to do any handwork if you have this wheel around your neck, right? You can't even see your own hands, at least in this position. But what's also quite curious that they were also a tool of hygiene at the end, because all kinds of powder, but also lice and other insects could be collected in this very thinly spider web-like lace. Coming to today, we're quite lucky that today's weavers, whether it's Annie Albers or Milo Forvinen or Hella Jungerius, for example, are not anymore in such difficult situation with their skills, and they have gained a lot of appreciation, of course. And we made a studio visit to Hella Jungerius and had a long interview with her. And what was interesting is that she is sort of working on the next frontier of weaving. She's trying to solve the question of woven architecture. So her starting point was frustration again, that it's not possible for a designer to interfere with mass-produced textile in a factory, because once you push the button on, it's on, and you can't stop the machine, it just runs. And she wanted to get her hands on this again. She wanted to work actually and, you know, manipulate the machine. So she started hacking the system in a hands-on approach and with her own, in her own studio. And maybe some of you have seen her exhibition at Anticipation a few years back, which was very beautiful and showed the first results of this. But what she did is she works with an experimental loom, the TC2 Jacquard loom, but she also built her very own 3D weaving loom, which is in the picture on the left-hand side. So basically you have 4 individual looms placed in a square, and together operating, they would create 3-dimensional shapes like this brick on the left-hand side, for example. And other examples is the one here on the right, which was done on a flat loom, but it was again woven in layers, and then cutting it open in kind of distinct spots with scissors, it opens up like a pop-up card, you know, maybe from your birthday party. So she is reinventing the way of how to weave. And why does she do it? She does it, and I think she says it quite beautifully. Sorry. Textile can have many different faces. It can be soft, it can be hard, it can be transparent, you can add sound or moist absorption or antibacterial layers. Imagine a brick that is structurally strong, but at the same time light and soft and pleasant to touch on one side. All these characteristics could be produced in the initial construction creation process without having to add additional layers of building material. Insulation could be integrated. You could create a pleasant environment, regulate the climate, and personalize colors, all with just one woven brick. The beauty is that she started with the question, what if? And I think what we do quite a lot, or we did quite a lot in New Giants, is as well ask, what if? So we have asked, what if the whole Earth catalog actually didn't exist? Or wasn't published in 1968. I don't know if you all know, but it was called by Steve Jobs the Bible of his generation, probably one of the most important publications in the world. It was a collection of essays and comments and product reviews, but what it mostly was, it was a how-to manual for people who were looking to become self-sufficient and independent. It did trigger the internet communities, YouTube tutorials, how-to manuals, and all kinds of collective communities there. Kevin Kelly, who was a member of the original Whole Earth catalog, in an interview really nicely tells kind of the impact that this could have. And what we are asking then, you know, had this not happened, is would there Fed Lab exist? Would open structure exist? Would we have the right to repair movement? Would youth joints even exist, we could ask, right? There's always a chain reaction to things. Other what ifs that we ask, how could our sneaker world look like if the Finnish sneaker or running shoe producer Koivu did not sell the 3 stripes to Adidas? Now there are the brand, the 3 stripes, but originally the 3 stripes were just invented as a functional stitch to hold the shoe together. You know, what if they hadn't sold it for a bottle of vodka and just a little bit of money? Or what would plywood look like had we already started many years ago use wood inherently lean as a glue? You have the black line, but you know, what would the aesthetic of wooden bent plywood chairs look like, for example? We could even wonder, looking at Pierre Paulin earlier, you know, would we have space age had Star Wars been just launched 10 years earlier? Or now we associate the aesthetics of space age with the Odyssey or Space Odyssey, but what if it was actually the used future aesthetics of George Lucas? We could ask also, you know, what happened if 2 gentlemen didn't have a fallout? Ford had a fallout with Robertson. Ford is the car producer, as you know. Robertson is an inventor of a screw, which actually had a kind of square socket, which some of experts today still say it's the world's best screw. Unfortunately, the two men had a disagreement before the Robertson screw could become the screw of Ford cars. Phillips stepped in, and today our world is full of Torxes. We could also ask why Louise Bingham, how could the world be if she hadn't gotten bored one summer in Spitsbergen and did not invent the first flatback furniture? Or what if Ensa Paris wasn't frustrated with the 1970s furniture industry? Would we actually have flatback furniture that doesn't break, for example, and that could actually be disassembled? So these are screws that we looked at, but what if the world actually didn't insist on anti-temper screws? That's also an important question to ask. Anti-temper screws were invented to protect an object that you're not supposed to open it, and there's good to it. But we can also ask whether it has gone too far. The most famous screws in this sense are the TA screw. It's the second up in the top left. It's McDonald's Happy Meal screw. So that's an anti-temper screw that the toys of the Happy Meal cannot be opened, or even more famously, probably the pentalobe of Apple. But, what if anti-temper screws wouldn't be such a thing? We could actually open things, and we could actually repair our washing machine, for example, rather than having to throw them out. So eventually you can see everything kind of links, and what we keep on saying is an obsession. I think it's the beauty of U-joints or any kind of open research that you can do, that you just continuously research and discover things. And there's a question, there's an answer, but immediately another question is being launched. At the end of the book, we have a collection of definitions by people who have contributed to the book. And also I think this list of definitions shows that a joint can be many things. There's its scientific definition, but there's so much more to discover if you kind of put on the head of Sherlock Holmes and look for the micro-stories and things. Cosa vuoi aggiungere?
Niente.
Niente.